This is lecture 77 in the ABCs of Communism that accompanies the textbook, The ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018, Volume 6. And our subject is again Namibia today, and we're going to be talking about the autochthonous sociocultural evolution from primitive communism through the chiefdoms and the early kingdoms that was stopped short by capitalist invasion. And we'll begin our discussion of the fight for modern communism that I'll continue with in the next lecture. So, after AD 1500, Namibian chiefdoms and kingdoms had increasing contact with other African servitude epic societies, and then the European interlopers. Thus, Namibia has an archaeological record of responses to both. And of special interest to historians has been the early colonial trading contact and other historical remains of that period, including the relatively undisturbed World War I battlefield sites. Of special interest to us is the detailed archaeological research into pre-white contact Namibia. There is a long tradition of archaeological survey, including the most modern efforts we discussed in the previous chapter, and a relatively dated cultural sequence that includes a large accumulation of documented rock art of primitive communist times. Among several current research initiatives is the Namib Desert Archaeological Survey, which represents the largest area study yet undertaken in Namibia. Archaeological sites in the Namib Desert provide unique proxy evidence of human responses to climatic shifts in a hyper-arid environment, and the project is a self-financing effort mainly based on archaeological assessments of the mining industry. So, in the pre-colonial period, there is a diversity of original peoples in Namibia, as we have seen. The most famous San Bushmen are contemporary inhabitants of the region that make up Namibia, Botswana, and South Africa. The San were and are nomadic hunters and gatherers. The most important part of their diet consisted of fruits, nuts, and roots, but they also hunted different kinds of antelopes. However, since the earliest Paleolithic, many different ethnic groups have lived in Namibia. The mode of production and even the ideological superstructure of any one of them applies to all of them. In the north, there are the Ovambo and Kavango peoples. The Ovambo and the smaller and closely related group of Kavango lived in northern Namibia, southern Angola, and in the case of the Kavango, western Zambia. Being settled people, they had an economy based on farming, cattle, and fishing, but they also produced metallic goods. Both groups belonged to the Bantu nation. They rarely ventured south to the central parts of the country, since the conditions there did not suit their farming way of life, but they extensively traded their knives and agricultural implements. Because they were made of iron, they were highly valued by all of their neighbors. Now, the Ovambo people are a southern African tribal ethnic group. They are the largest ethnic group of Namibia, found in its northern regions and pronounced Ovambo. They are also found in the southern Angolan province of Kunini, where the name Ambo is more common. The Ovambo consist of a number of kindred Bantu ethnic groups who inhabit what was formerly called Ovambo land. Accounting for about 50% of the Namibian population, the Ovambo are its largest ethnic group, and they speak the Ovambo language that belongs to the southern branch of the Niger-Congo language family. In Angola, they are a minority, accounting for about 2% of the total Angolan population. The Ovambo people reside in the flat, sandy, grassy plains of North Namibia and the Kunene province of South Angola. Sometimes referred to as, we have seen, Ovambo land, these high-altitude plains are flat and stoneless. Flash flood oceanas cause seasonal rainfall that floods the region into temporary lakes and islands. In the dry season, these pools of water disappear. In the northern region, there is tropical vegetation. The Ovambo people have adapted their housing and modes of production to the seasonal weather patterns. The traditional home is a kraal, that is Kraal, complex of huts surrounded by a fence of large vertical poles. Each hut has a purpose, such as an onjugo, or sleeping quarters, or a pata, or kitchen. The Ovambo are sedentary agriculturalists and pastoralists. Their staple crops are millet, sorghum, and beans, and in drier regions or seasons, pastoral activity with herds of cattle, goats, and sheep take precedence in their mode of production. Their animal husbandry is a source of milk as well as meat, and is supplemented by hunting, gathering, and fishing. During the colonial era, the English and Dutch white capitalists demanded that the Ovambo people hunt elephants for their ivory tusks. This nearly drove the elephants to extinction. Left over from Namibia's immediate past was the ATC structure, that is, the Advanced Theocratic Chiefdom structure. Invading armed white-capped farmers demanded that the Ovambo hereditary chief be responsible to them for what the invaders called their tribe. In the historiography of the invaders, the meaning of the word tribe was made derogatory. The invaders, once installed, demanded that the bosses they had chosen be considered members of the royal family of Ovambo land. The result was that those who belonged to this family by birth through the maternal line had the only legitimate claim to being chiefs of their tribe. Polygyny, that is, one man and several women in marriage, was accepted by the new rulers, with the first wife recognized as the senior. The ethnography of Namibia is far more complex in terms of marriage and post-marital residence, but the invaders saw this as one more way to prove the inferiority of the now post-invasion extant system among what they called the natives. When Germany established a colony in Namibia in 1884, they left the Ovambo people undisturbed. The Germans focused on the southern and coastal regions. After the World War I, Namibia was annexed into the South African administration by the British as the Southwest Africa province of Southwest Africa. This brought major changes, with South African plantation, cattle breeding, and mining operations entering the Ovambo land. The colonial Portuguese administration in Angola, who had previously focused on their coastal northern and eastern operations, entered southern Angola to form a border to the expanding South African and British imperial interests. The Ovambo people launched several armed resistances in the 1920s and 1930s, which were all crushed militarily by the British and Portuguese forces. The South African administration continued the so-called police zone in the south, a region created by the Germans covering about two-thirds of the province, later to become Namibia. Ovambo people were not allowed to move into the police zone. Neither other tribes nor Europeans could move north without permits. This isolated the Ovambo people. However, because of labor shortage in the police zone and South Africa, and because of the white massacre of Africans such as through the Herero Namaqua Genocide, the South African government allowed migrant wage labor. Numerous Ovambo people became migrant labor, with segregation minus any form of human rights in South African towns such as Cape Town and in the police zone. In 1948, the South African white dictatorship brought USA-style segregation to South Africa and established what they called apartheid rule. Simultaneously, this was brought into the Ovambo land. The South African government declared the Ovambo land as an independent province in 1973 and appointed chiefs aligned with them. Now, Kavango was one of the 5 kingdoms in Namibia at the time of white contact. Its Bantu people spoke the Kwangale language. The kingdom has a long tradition of female rulers inherited from the Advanced Theocratic Chiefdom stage. At the time of white contact, their mode of production was pastoral and millet agriculture, supplemented by extensive river fishing. The other 4 kingdoms were the Mbunza, Shambuyu, Geiriku, and Mbukushu. Each had recently evolved from its own Advanced Theocratic Chiefdom stage and were at the time of white contact. Now we come to the Khoisan immigration, the Nama and Damara. Until AD 100, the original hunters and gatherers of the San people were the only inhabitants of Namibia. At that time, the Nama and Kokoi settled around the Orange River in the south, that is, on the border between Namibia and South Africa, where they kept herds of sheep and goats. Both the San and Nama spoke languages belonging to the Khoisan language group. In the AD 800s, the Damara entered Namibia. The Damara separated themselves early on from the Bantu of southern and central Africa and moved to southwest Africa. Their geographic earlier location is unclear, but they settled in the grasslands of central Namibia, later known as Damara land. During the AD 1600s, the Herero, a pastoral nomadic people keeping cattle, moved into Namibia, and they came from the East African lakes and entered Namibia from the northwest. First they resided in Kauko land, but in AD 1850 some of their kin moved farther south into Damara land. A number of tribes remained in Kauko land, and these were the Himba people, who are still there today. Invasion. European capitalist farmers arrive. As Iberian feudalism cut short autochthonous New World servitude epic societies, so did European capitalism cut short the autochthonous Namibian servitude epic. In AD 1485, the first European to set foot on Namibian soil was the Portuguese Diogo Cao. He stopped briefly on the Skeleton Coast, and he raised a limestone cross there on his exploratory mission along the west coast of Africa. The next European to visit Namibia was also a Portuguese, Bartolomeu Dias, who stopped at what today is Walvis Bay and Lüderitz, which he named Angra Pequena, on his way to rounding the Cape of Good Hope. The inhospitable Namib Desert constituted a formidable barrier, and neither of the Portuguese explorers went further inland. In AD 1652, the Dutch were the first European trading power to set up a permanent settlement in South Africa when the Dutch East India Company built a fort and established a supply station founding Cape Town. The Dutch East India Company established a small settlement at what is now Cape Town in 1652, as we've seen, and the initial purpose of that settlement was to provide a rest stop and supply station for trading vessels making the long journey from Europe around the Cape of Southern Africa and on to India and other points eastward. Enslavement of Africans by the armed cap farmers was a central feature of the Dutch colony from day one of their arrival. The first violent conflicts between the Dutch thugs and the Africans date from 1659. For the next 50 years, the invaders slaughtered the Africans with weaponized disease, smallpox, and mass ambushes, reducing the Khoi they named Hottentot to near extinction. Colony administrators and their bosses, who were a few wealthy white farmers, controlled all the land and natural resources. Left out of the initial stolen wealth distribution were the mass of white settlers who remained landless. This fucked-over strata of invaders gave rise to the first trekkers. In the AD 1700s, they branched out from their Cape Town main bastion, expanding into Black Africa to the north and the east. Now, these trekkers had limited contact with mainstream Dutch culture, including what passed for colonial culture. Colonial government beyond the Cape Town region was non-existent. This was a true, very large class of poor white trash. So the trekkers made their own way in dealing with native Africans. The trekkers had no schools nor saw any need for education beyond their primitive Protestant prejudices. Infrequent trips to Cape Town meant de facto ignorance of what was happening in Europe, and many trekkers owned slaves. The trekkers formed commando units for military action against native Africans. The largest group in South Africa was the Bantu Xhosa. Periodic warfare between the poor white trash truckers and the Xhosa was constant in the 1700s, and it was common practice for the lumpen trekkers to kill all native adults when victorious, while keeping their children to use as slave laborers and prostitutes. The majority of trekkers simply eked out subsistence in Africa as they had in Holland. Of course, the trekkers knew their fate was ignored in Cape Town. For the most part, their future was daily a matter of ruler concern only as far as to whether the trash should also be enslaved, as their slave stage society continued. Two-thirds of Cape Town residents in 1795 were black slaves, and a strong contingent of rulers wanted to put the white trash into that status as well. Unlike the New England colonies for Great Britain, the Cape settlement was not a major political topic or concern for Holland. Most Europeans thought of Cape Town as a pit stop with its 15,000 whites. In 1793, the Dutch authority in the Cape decided to take control of Walvis Bay, since it was the only good deep-water harbor along the Skeleton Coast. When the United Kingdom took control of the Cape Colony in 1797, they also took over Walvis Bay. But white settlement in the area was limited, and neither the Dutch nor the British penetrated far into the country. The British Caps take command. By 1795, military results of the French Revolution had reduced Holland to a satellite status, and as a consequence of France. So England took control of the Dutch South African colony for the first time. In 1806, the takeover of Dutch South Africa was made permanent by the UK Cap government. In 1810, England formally annexed South Africa. The Brit rulers were faced with an angry, growing mob of unemployed, for which transportation to penal colonies had been their only answer. In 1820, large numbers of would-be settlers began arriving in South Africa from England, and this was the Brit capitalist government program to relieve poverty at home. However, for Africans, British colonial rule was just as bad as Dutch rule. In 1828, however, more pressing concerns in other parts of the imperialist world led the UK South African office to announce legal rights and equality before the law for the Khokoi in the Cape Colony. All slaves were to be freed by 1838, and these changes were not well received by the Dutch, poor white trash colonists, disappointed at Britain's refusal to seize more African land. Angrier were the rich Dutch slave owners because of the low rate of compensation paid to them as now legally dispossessed slave owners. White South African nationalism spreads to Namibia. The Dutch resentment against English rule led some of the Dutch colonists to embark on the Great Trek of the 1820s and 30s. Now this was much larger than the 1700s trek we reviewed above. Rather, this was to be a sustained effort to achieve both white Dutch control over black African land, and it was combined with a demand for autonomy from the English crown. In other words, this second new trek had a new objective. Namely, these trekkers were consciously forging a new, distinct national and cultural identity. They wanted their own republic, distinct from Holland, in opposition to indigenous black Africans and the English. This was Afrikaner nationalism, facilitated by the new dialect of Dutch called Afrikaans. Central to the effort was the creation of the origin myth, based on fatuous accounts of brutal battles with the Zulus, such as an 1838 battle that killed 3,000 Zulus in a single day. At any rate, in the 1800s, white farmers, mostly Dutch Boers, moved farther north, killing the indigenous Khoisan peoples along the way. The Khoisan put up a fierce resistance across the Orange River. And meanwhile, in 1805, the London Missionary Society began working in Namibia, moving north from the Cape Colony. In 1811, that missionary society founded the town Bethany in southern Namibia, where they built a church, which today is Namibia's oldest building. Bleed and breed. On the border of white land and black land in the southern African Cape were people of mixed race and culture called the Oorlams and the Basters. These people originated as another of ethnological history's proofs that people in contact either bleed or breed, or more often do both. Among the Namaqua peoples, some known as the Oorlams, on the border of white land in Namibia, adopted Boer customs and a dialect of Afrikaans. Acquiring guns, the Orlams settled in the Namaqua region of Namibia and South Africa. That region extends along the west coast over 600 miles, covering an area of 170,000 square miles. Eventually, the Orlams came into conflict with other Nama Khoisan people, and under the leadership of Juncker Afrikaner, the Orlams used their superior weaponry to seize the best grazing land. In the 1830s, Juncker Afrikaner concluded an agreement with the Nama chief, Oseb, whereby the Orlams would protect the central grasslands of Namibia from the Herero people who were then pushing south. In return, Juncker Afrikaner was recognized as overlord and regularly received tribute from the Nama. He settled permanently at what today is Windhoek, on the borders of Herero territory. Now these Afrikaners soon came in conflict with the Herero who entered Damara land from the south at about the same time as the Juncker Afrikaner clique started to expand farther north from Namaqua land. Both the Herero and the Afrikaner wanted to use the grasslands of Damara land for their herds, and this resulted in warfare between the Herero and Orlams, as well as between the two of them and the Damara, who were the original inhabitants of the area. The fighting displaced the Damara and many were killed. With their horses and guns, the Orlam Afrikaners proved militarily superior and forced the Herero to give them cattle as tribute. The last group of indigenous people to arrive in Namibia were the Basters. These were descendants of Boer men and African Nama women, Calvinist and African-speaking, and they were more white than black in their own minds, at any rate. In the 1840s, the German Rhenish Missionary Society started working in Namibia and cooperated with the London Missionary Society. In the 1800s, the European capitalist powers entered their imperialist final phase and began carving up the African continent between themselves. This phase their ideologists called the Scramble for Africa. Foremost in Namibia among the scramblers were the newcomers challenging the original Dutch interlopers, Germany and Great Britain. However, in 1868, they, along with the Orlams, had been forced northwards by the expansion of white settlers who saw any colored skin as bad. A group of about 90 families of these bastards crossed the Orange River into Namibia. They made it as far as central Namibia before announcing their discovery of the Promised Land, where they found the city of Rehoboth, a kind of a group of African Mormon types. In 1872, they founded the Free Republic of Rehoboth and adopted a constitution. That document said the republic would have a chief executive called a captain, directly elected by the people, and furthermore there were to be a consigliere council, or Volkrad, consisting of 3 directly elected citizens. The scramble continues. Imperialism divides Africa. The first territorial claim on part of Namibia came when Britain occupied Walvis Bay, confirming the settlement of 1797, and permitted the Cape Colony to annex it in 1878. The annexation was an attempt to forestall German ambitions in the area and also guaranteed control of the good Deepwater Harbor on the way to the Cape Colony and other British colonies on Africa's east coast. In 1883, a German trader named Adolf Luderitz bought Angra Pequena from the Nama chief Joseph Fredericks II. The price he paid was 10,000 marks and 260 guns. He soon renamed the coastal area after himself, giving it the name Luderitz. Believing that Britain was soon about to declare the whole area a protectorate, Luderitz advised the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck to stake a claim. In 1884, Bismarck did so, thereby establishing German Southwest Africa as a colony. One region, the Caprivi Strip, became a part of the German Southwest Africa after the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty of the 1st of July 1890 between the United Kingdom and Germany. The Caprivi Strip in Namibia gave Germany access to the Zambezi River and thereby to German colonies in East Africa. In exchange for the island of Heligoland in the North Sea, Britain took control of the island of Zanzibar in East Africa. Soon after declaring Luderitz and a vast area along the Atlantic coast of German protectorate, German troops were deployed as conflicts with the native tribes flared up, most significantly with the Namaqua. Under the leadership of the tribal chief Hendrik Witbooi, the Namaqua put up a fierce resistance to the German occupation. Contemporary media called the conflict the Hottentot Uprising. The Namaqua's resistance proved unsuccessful, however, and in 1894 Witbooi was forced to sign a protection treaty with the Germans. The treaty allowed the Namaqua to keep their arms, and Witbooi was released on his own recognizance, promising to discontinue the Hottentot Uprising. In 1894, Major Theodore Lipwein was appointed governor of German Southwest Africa. He tried without great success to apply the principle of colonialism without bloodshed. The protection treaty did have the effect of stabilizing the situation, but pockets of rebellion persisted and were put down by an elite German regiment, the Schutztruppe. While real peace was never achieved between the colonialists and the natives, being the only German colony considered suitable for white settlement at the time, Namibia continued to attract a large influx of German settlers. In 1903, there were 3,700 Germans living in the colony. 7 years later, by 1910, their number had increased to 13,000. Now, in 1908, diamonds were first found in Namibia, so another reason for German influx was on the table, and thereafter diamond production was very important in Namibia's economy. The settlers were encouraged by the government to steal land from the natives, and they were to force them into uncompensated constructive labor indistinguishable from slavery. Thus, relations between the German settlers and the natives inevitably spiraled into war. The ongoing local rebellions escalated in 1904 into the Herero and Namaqua Wars, when the Herero attacked remote farms on the countryside, killing approximately 150 Germans. The outbreak of rebellion was considered to be a result of Theodore Lutwein's softer tactics, and he was replaced by the more notorious General Lothar von Trotha. In the beginning of the war, the Herero, under the leadership of Chief Samuel Maharero, had the upper hand. With good knowledge of the terrain, they had little problem in defending themselves against the Schutztruppe, which numbered only 766. Soon the Namaqua people joined the war, again under the leadership of Hendrik Witbooi. Now, to cope with the situation, Germany sent 14,000 additional troops, who soon crushed the rebellion in the Battle of Waterberg in 1905. Earlier, von Trotha issued an ultimatum to the Herero, denying them citizenship rights and ordering them to leave the country or be killed. In order to escape, the Herero retreated into the waterless Omahiki region, a western arm of the Kalahari Desert, where many of them died of thirst. The German forces guarded every water source and were given orders to shoot any adult male Herero on sight. Only a few of them managed to escape into neighboring British territories. These tragic events, known as the Herero and Namaqua Genocide, resulted in the deaths of between 24,000 and 55,000 Herero, estimated at 50 to 70% of the total Herero population. And 10,000 Nama were killed also, 50% of the total Nama population. The genocide was characterized by the widespread death by starvation and from consumption of well water, which had been poisoned by the Germans in the Namib Desert. Descendants of Lothar von Trotha apologized to 6 chiefs of the Herero royal houses for their actions on their ancestor on the 7th of October of 2007. And I'm sure they greatly appreciated that. In 1915, during World War I, South Africa, being a member of the British Commonwealth and a former British colony, occupied the German colony of Southwest Africa. In February 1917, Mandume Ya Ndimufayo, the last king of the Kwanyama of Ovambo land, was killed in a joint attack by South African forces for resisting South African sovereignty over his people. And on the 17th of December 1920, South Africa undertook the administration of Southwest Africa under the terms of Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations and a Class C mandate agreement by the League Council. This Class C mandate, supposed to be used for the least developed territories, gave South Africa full power of administration and legislation over the territory, but required that South Africa promote the material and moral well-being and social progress of the people. Following the League's supersession of the United Nations in 1946, South Africa refused to surrender its earlier mandate to be replaced by the United Nations Trusteeship Agreement, requiring closer international monitoring of the territory's administration. Although the South African government wanted to incorporate Southwest Africa into its territory, it never officially did so, although it was administered as the de facto fifth province, with the white minority having representation in the whites-only parliament of South Africa. In 1959, the colonial forces in Windhoek sought to remove black residents further away from the white area of the town, and the residents protested, and the subsequent killing of 11 protesters spawned a major Namibian nationalist following and the formation of a united black opposition to South African rule. During the 1960s, as the European powers granted independence to their colonies and trust territories in Africa, pressure mounted on South Africa to do so in Namibia, which was then Southwest Africa. On the dismissal in 1966 by the International Court of Justice of a complaint brought by Ethiopia and Liberia against South Africa's continued presence in the territory, the UN General Assembly revoked South Africa's mandate. Under the growing international pressure to legitimate its annexation of Namibia, South Africa established in 1962 the Commission of Inquiry into Southwest African Affairs, better known as the Odendaal Commission, named after Franz Hendrik Odendaal, who headed the commission. Its goal was to introduce South African racist homeland politics in Namibia, while at the same time present the occupation as a progressive and scientific way to develop and support the people in Namibia. Now finally we come to Namibia's struggle for independence, or at least I'm going to begin the discussion of it here. Also in 1966, the Southwest African People's Organization, SWAPO, SWAPO in caps, military wing, the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, PLAN, began guerrilla attacks on South African forces infiltrating the territory from bases in Zambia. The first attack of this kind was the battle at Omagulu Wombashi on the 26th of August. After Angola became independent in 1975, SWAPO established bases in the southern part of the country. Hostilities intensified over the years, especially in Owambo-land. In a 1971 advisory opinion, the International Court of Justice upheld UN authority over Namibia, determining that the South African presence in Namibia was illegal and that South Africa therefore was obliged to withdraw its administration from Namibia immediately. The court also advised UN member states to refrain from implying legal recognition or assistance to the South African presence. While previously the contract workforce was seen as primitive and lacking political consciousness, in the summer of 71-72 there was a general strike of 25% of the entire working population, that is 13,000 people, starting in Windhoek and Walvis Bay and soon spreading to Tsumeb and other mines. In 1975, South Africa sponsored the Turnbull Constitution Conference, which sought an internal settlement to Namibia. Excluding SWAPO, the conference mainly included Bantustan leaders as well as white Namibian political parties. And that brings us to a conclusion of this lecture, and in the next one we're going to talk about Namibia's fight for modern communism, which is also part of the fight for communism in Angola, where we have the first two communist governments in Africa.